The galaxy sent its finest machines. She sent back dinner. Priya Nandakumar had flour on her hands when the ships arrived, not metaphorically, not in some poetic sense. She was standing at the kitchen counter of the Kepler 7 colony outpost, knuckles pressed into a mound of whole wheat dough, her sari tucked up at the waist, her reading glasses pushed to the top of her head where she had forgotten them 40 minutes ago, and she was making rotis, real ones, the kind her mother had taught her. Press the heel of the hand forward, fold, turn, press again, feel the dough breathe. The colony's processed nutrition dispensers had broken down for the third time this month. The replacement parts were 6 weeks out on a supply freighter, and 43 people were going to want dinner in 2 hours. So Priya was making rotis. She heard the alert tone first, a 3-beat chime that the colony used for atmospheric anomalies, meteor showers, unexpected ship arrivals. She ignored it for exactly as long as it took her to finish pressing the roti she was working on. Then she set it on the hot tawa pan, watched the first blister form, and walked to the window. The sky above the Kepler 7 plains was the color of old brass at that hour, the twin moons of the colony just visible above the ridge. And descending through the upper atmosphere in a perfect formation of 7 were shapes she had never seen before. Not Confederation vessels, not supply freighters, not any class of ship in the colonial registry she had spent 12 years helping to maintain. They were roughly cylindrical, enormous, and they moved with the kind of deliberate patience that told her immediately they were not in a hurry. Things that moved like that were never in a hurry. Things that moved like that had all the time in the universe, and knew it. She walked back to the tawa and flipped the roti. It was not that she was unafraid. She was afraid. Her stomach had gone cold and her hands were very still. And she was acutely aware of the 43 other people in the outpost, and the 11 children among them, and the fear moved through her like ice water in a channel, fast and direct. But the roti would burn if she left it, and burning food was a waste, and she had been raised by a woman who considered wasted food a small sin. So she flipped the roti, pressed it gently with the spatula, watched it puff, a perfect round balloon of steam, and then she moved it to the rack and reached for the comm. This is Priya Nandakumar in the outpost kitchen. I'm looking at 7 unregistered vessels on descent approach. Somebody want to tell me if I should be worried or should I just keep making dinner? The comm channel erupted. She kept making dinner. The Vareth did not announce themselves. That was the first thing the exolinguists pieced together in the frantic hours that followed the landing, parsing the dense shortwave signals the ships broadcast on repeat. The Vareth did not have a concept of announcement. You simply arrived. You made your presence known by being present. The idea that you would signal your intentions ahead of arrival, that you would ask permission, that you would knock. All of this was, in their understanding, a form of weakness so profound it was barely distinguishable from illness. They landed on the Kepler 7 plains 3 kilometers from the outpost. All 7 ships, perfectly spaced, perfectly silent after the landing burn. The ramp of the lead vessel descended, and the first Vareth stepped out into the colony's thin air. And the colony's automated sensors recorded everything. Approximately 3 meters tall, bilateral symmetry but with 4 upper limbs instead of 2. An exoskeletal structure that appeared ceramic, rather than chitinous, no visible eyes in any conventional sense, but a band of photoreceptive tissue, running around the circumference of the head like a crown, skin, or what passed for skin, the color of old pewter, and a movement so fluid and so quiet that the sensor logs would later note, with the flat objectivity of machine recording, that the Vareth's footsteps registered less acoustic impact than a human child's. There were 12 of them. They stood in a line and they looked at the outpost, and they waited. Administrator Yusuf Chen was the one who walked out to meet them. He had a translator drone and his most authoritative expression and absolutely no idea what he was doing. He was a good administrator, meticulous, fair, the kind of man who knew every colonist by name and could tell you their children's birthdays. But nothing in his training had prepared him for this. Nothing in anyone's training had prepared them for this. The Vareth had arrived at 47 human settlements across 3 star systems in the same 48-hour window, and the Confederation's emergency channels were burning with the same raw, terrified uncertainty. What do they want? The translator drone worked for 6 minutes before producing anything useful. The Vareth communicated in layered frequencies, some acoustic, some subsonic, some in ranges the human ear could not resolve, and the drone had to build the translation matrix from scratch. When it finally spoke, The voice it rendered was flat and neutral, stripped of whatever tonal complexity the original carried. "This world is assessed," it said. "You will demonstrate viability or vacate." Yusuf Chen opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "I'm sorry. Demonstrate viability how?" There was a pause of exactly 3 seconds. The Vareth did not move. The one in the lead, the one who seemed to be speaking, did not blink because it had no eyes to blink. But something in its posture shifted in a way the translator drone flagged as emphasis. "Produce," it said, "or be classified as non-viable." And then they simply stood there, all 12 of them, waiting. Yusuf Chen went back to the outpost and called an emergency meeting. Priya Nandakumar came to the meeting with a plate of rotis, because she had made too many, and someone was going to eat them. And she set them in the center of the table, and listened to 40 minutes of argument. And she ate 2 rotis, and she thought very carefully. "They said produce," she said during a pause in the argument. Everyone looked at her. "They said demonstrate viability. They said produce or vacate." She picked up a 3rd roti, tore a small piece from it, thought about it. "That's not a military assessment. Military assessments don't use that language. They're not asking if we can fight. They're asking if we can sustain ourselves." "You got all that from one word?" said Dr. Okafor, the colony's lead biologist. "Got that from 12 years reading colonial viability reports," Priya said. "The language is the same. Produce, demonstrate viability. These are census terms." She looked at the roti in her hand. "They're not here to conquer us. They're here to decide if we're worth leaving alive." The room went very quiet. "Then what do we do?" Yusuf asked. Priya set down the roti. She pushed her reading glasses up to her forehead, which is where they always ended up, and she looked at the wall, and she thought about her mother and the recipe box that had come down through 4 generations of women who had kept their families fed through droughts and famines and partition and poverty and all the ordinary catastrophes that humans called history. She thought about the 43 people in this outpost and the 11 children and the 6 weeks before the supply freighter and the nutrition dispensers that kept breaking down. "We do what we do," she said. "We make food." The Vareth were given a section of the outpost common area as an observation space. Administrator Chen's idea. Priya thought it was probably a mistake, but she was not the administrator. 3 of the 12 entered the outpost and simply stood there, watching, their photoreceptive band scanning the space in slow rotations, recording everything. The other 9 remained outside with their ships. The translator drone was repositioned near the 3 inside. They watched everything. They watched the water reclamation system. They watched the hydroponic bays. They watched the engineering team run diagnostics on the broken nutrition dispensers. They watched 2 children play in the corridor and then stood very still for a long moment, their photoreceptive bands oriented toward the children, and something in their posture conveyed a quality that the translator drone could not yet render, but which Priya, watching from across the common area, recognized from years of watching her son play video games in a basement room with neon lights. Attention. Total, complete, undivided attention. She went to the kitchen. The outpost kitchen was her domain in the way that nothing else in the colony was. She had not been assigned it. She was technically the colony's logistics coordinator, but in the years since they had arrived on Kepler 7, she had simply been the one who cooked. It had started as a practical necessity and become something else. The kitchen was the one place in the outpost where the rules of space and resource management and efficiency reporting bent slightly, where something older than all of those things operated. You brought food to people, people ate, people were sustained. That was the whole logic, and it was a logic older than civilization, older than language, possibly older than thought. She had fresh turmeric from the hydroponic bay, dried lentils, a supply of spices she had been carefully rationing for 3 months, and she had the flour she had been using earlier. She had onions, charred at the edges because she liked them that way. She had a technique passed down through her family like inheritance, adjusted over 12 years of cooking with colony supplies, refined against the specific challenges of a colony kitchen. Different air pressure, different water mineral content, a different relationship between heat and time. She started cooking. She was not thinking about the Vareth when she started. She was thinking about the 43 people in the outpost, and about Yusuf Chen, who had not eaten anything since the ships arrived, and whose face had the particular gray pallor of a man running entirely on adrenaline and dread, and about the children, who needed the ordinary reassurance of dinner being made, of the smell of food coming from somewhere, of the world continuing to function in recognizable ways. She cooked for the same reason she had always cooked, because people needed to eat, and she was there, and she knew how. She did not notice the Vareth moving closer until she turned to check the doll and found one of the three, standing in the kitchen doorway. It was enormous in the small space. Its 4 upper limbs were folded in a configuration she had not seen before. Not relaxed, not aggressive, something in between, something she could not read yet. Its photoreceptive band was oriented toward the stove, toward the pots, toward her hands on the handle of the wooden spoon. She looked at it for a moment. Then she turned back to the dowel and stirred it. The Vareth did not move. After 30 seconds of silence, she said without looking at it, "You can watch if you want. I don't mind." The translator drone, perched on the counter where she had put it earlier, buzzed softly as it rendered her words. She did not know if the Vareth understood, but it stepped forward into the kitchen, and it stood there and it watched. She stirred the dowel. She adjusted the flame. She reached for the turmeric, a pinch, then a second pinch, because she was cooking for 43, and the dowel was for all of them, and she added it, and the kitchen filled immediately with that specific, sharp golden warmth that she associated with every kitchen she had ever stood in, her mother's and her grandmother's, and the small apartment in Chennai where she had first lived alone, 22 years old and cooking dal for herself for the first time, and getting it slightly wrong in a way she had never quite forgotten. The Vareth made a sound, very quiet. Below the register the translator drone was programmed to engage with, but audible, a faint harmonic resonance, almost vibrational, emanating from somewhere in its torso structure. The translator drone said, "Query, what is the function of the yellow substance?" Priya glanced at the turmeric. "It's a spice, flavors the food." She paused. "Also anti-inflammatory. Also it makes things look beautiful." She held up the small pot of ground turmeric so the Vareth could see it. 3 jobs at once. Very efficient. The Vareth was quiet for another moment. Then, the substance has industrial application and aesthetic application and nutritional application simultaneously. "Yes," she said. "We call that cooking." Word spread through the outpost quickly, as word always did in small communities. Priya was cooking, and one of the aliens was in the kitchen watching her. This produced a complicated set of reactions. Several colonists thought it was dangerous. Several thought it was the most surreal thing they had ever heard of. Dr. Okafor thought it was potentially the most important cross-species encounter in human history, and asked if he could observe, but Priya told him the kitchen was too small, and he would have to wait for dinner like everyone else. Yusuf Chen came to the kitchen door at one point and stood there looking at the scene, Priya at the stove, the enormous alien standing 2 meters away watching her work, with an expression that contained approximately equal parts relief and terror. Priya handed him a bowl of the dal she had already made and told him to eat it before he fell over. He ate it leaning against the door frame, and the Vareth turned its photoreceptive band toward him briefly, and then back to Priya. "It keeps watching you," Yusuf said quietly. "I know," she said. She was working on the rotis now, the motions practiced and automatic, the rhythm of press-fold-turn that she could do without thinking. "It asked me about the turmeric. I think it's running some kind of analysis." "What did you tell it?" "The truth." She pressed a roti flat, set it on the tawa. "I think that's what we should be doing, telling the truth." Yusuf was quiet for a moment. "The Confederation has been transmitting standard first contact protocols to all 47 sites. Formal introductions, species designation, territorial boundaries, political structure. And the Vareth haven't responded to any of it." He looked at the alien in the kitchen. "They're responding to you." The roti puffed. Priya pressed it gently, watched the steam rise. "They said produce," she said. "That's what they're watching for." The second Vareth arrived at the kitchen door around the time Priya started on the biryani. This was not a small undertaking. Biryani was not fast food, was not simple food, was not food that could be rushed without becoming something other than itself. It was layered food. Rice and spices and protein and caramelized onion and the careful sealing of the pot so the steam did the work of the last cooking, the dumb process, the food essentially finishing itself in its own heat. It required patience. It required attention. It required the accumulated knowledge of every cook who had ever made it. All the small adjustments and corrections and the specific intuitions that could not be written down, but had to be passed hand to hand. Priya had learned biryani from her mother-in-law, Usha, and this had been a complicated transaction. Usha had not offered the recipe freely. The recipe had been in Usha's family for 3 generations. written in a notebook that Usha kept in a locked drawer, and she had always maintained that she would share it when the time was right, and the time had always turned out not to be right. There had been a period, during the early years of her marriage, when Priya had tried to reverse engineer the recipe from memory of eating it, and she had gotten close but never quite there. Something always off, a spice ratio slightly wrong, the rice not quite achieving the right separation. Then, 2 years before Priya left for the colony, Usha had gotten sick. Not terminally, but seriously enough to make her reassess what she was holding on to and why. She had called Priya to her kitchen, and she had opened the notebook and she had showed her, not read it to her, showed her, Priya standing at her elbow watching every step. And she had said nothing beyond the practical instructions. And Priya had understood that this was the full weight of what she was being given. She had never made it the same way twice, because the ingredients changed, and the kitchen changed, and the people changed, and the biryani changed with them. But the structure was always Usha's, and beneath that it was whoever had taught Usha, and beneath that it went back further than either of them could trace. The biryani was halfway through its dum when the third Varath arrived at the kitchen door. All 3 of them standing in a line, photoreceptive bands oriented toward the sealed pot on the stove, from which the steam was beginning to seep around the edges of the cloth seal. Priya had pressed around the lid. The translator drone had been placed on a shelf now, higher up, better positioned for multi-directional communication. The first Varath, the one who had arrived earliest, the one Priya had been unconsciously thinking of as the primary, though she had no real basis for the designation, produced a sound. The drone translated it after a 2-second processing delay. The preparation is multi-stage, it said. The compounds are combined in sequence. The sequence is not arbitrary. No, Priya agreed. The sequence is the recipe. Recipe, the drone echoed with a tone shift she had noticed it used when it encountered a word it was logging as culturally significant. Define. Priya thought about it for a moment. She was still working. She had the side dishes to finish, the raita, the papad, the small sweet she made for the children from condensed milk and cardamom, and she worked while she thought. A recipe is a set of instructions, she said slowly, but it's also a history. Every recipe has a person behind it, and a person behind that person, and it goes back further than any of us can see. When I make this biryani, I'm not just making food. I'm doing something that the women in my family have done for as long as my family has existed. The recipe is the chain. She paused. I'm not sure how to translate that. The drone buzzed, a longer silence than usual from the Varath. Then, the preparation contains encoded generational information. Yes, Priya said, exactly that. Another silence. Longer this time. All 3 of them still and very focused. The primary said, what is the function of the chain? Priya looked at the sealed biryani pot. She thought about Usha in that kitchen, the locked drawer, the years of not yet, and the moment when not yet became now. She thought about her own son, Arjun, 24 years old, a video game designer living in a habitat module 6 light-years from here, who had grown up eating her food, and who she had not seen in 3 years, and whose she missed in a way that was sometimes a small, dull ache and, sometimes unexpectedly, a sharp and immediate pain. The chain is how we know who we are, she said. We're very good at losing things. We move across space now. We scatter. We go so far from each other that sometimes I think we forget we're still connected. The chain is the reminder. She lifted the edge of the cloth on the biryani pot, just slightly, just to check, and the steam came out fragrant, and she knew it was nearly ready. It's also just how you make sure the recipe is good. 4 generations of people refining the same dish. That's a lot of quality control. The primary made a sound the drone did not translate, but the 3 Varath shifted, a small movement, a collective realignment of posture, the kind of movement that Priya had learned in 40 minutes of watching them, meant something was being processed at a level beyond what the drone could yet render. She pressed her glasses back up to the top of her head and went to finish the raita. Dinner was served in the outpost common area at 1900 hours, Kepler 7 local time. It was a small thing and a large thing simultaneously. The colonists came in quietly, some of them afraid, all of them aware of the 3 aliens standing at the edge of the room, and they took their plates and they sat down and they ate. The biryani went first, as it always did, because the smell of it reached them before they even entered the room. That layered warmth of saffron and fried onion, and the particular perfume of dub-cooked rice that was one of the oldest smells in human civilization. A smell that had meant sustenance and care, and the effort of someone's hands for as long as people had been cooking it. The children sat together at their usual table and ate without the self-consciousness of the adults. One of the youngest, a 5-year-old girl named Ida, who had been born on the colony and had never seen Earth, looked at the Vareth for approximately 30 seconds, and then looked at her biryani and decided the biryani was more interesting. Priya, moving between the kitchen and the serving table, saw this and felt something loosen in her chest. The primary watched all of this. It watched the plates being filled. It watched people eat. It watched the specific human behavior of sharing food, the way someone passed a dish to a neighbor, the way Yusuf Chen, eating properly for the first time in hours, involuntarily closed his eyes for a moment when he tasted the biryani. It watched the children eat without hesitation. It watched the conversation begin, slowly, tentatively, people talking to each other again. The ordinary human reassertion that things were still functioning, that they were still here, that dinner existed. After 40 minutes, the primary approached Priya at the serving table. She looked up at it. 3 meters of alien architecture, 4 limbs, no face she could read, and yet she had been in its presence for hours now, and presence accumulated, and she was beginning to understand its silences the way she understood her mother-in-law's silences. Not through translation, but through attention. The drone following the primary spoke, query, the colonists. They are, a pause, a processing delay longer than usual. Sustained, yes, she said. That's what food does. Another pause, the preparation consumed significant resources. The time cost was disproportionate. Simpler intake would achieve equivalent caloric delivery. Priya reached under the serving table and brought out the small sweets she had made. The condensed milk rounds with cardamom, pressed into shapes by hand, the kind her mother made at festivals. She set one on the edge of the table nearest the primary. Simpler intake sustains the body, she said. This sustains everything else. She gestured at the room, at the people eating, at Ida, who had finished her biryani and was now telling the girl next to her something with great animation, her hands moving, at Dr. Okafor, who had started laughing at something for the first time all day, at Yusuf Chen, who was sitting with a colonist who had been frightened and alone in the back corner, and they were eating together, and that small act of sitting together was doing something that no policy statement or first contact protocol could have done. There is no efficiency calculation for that, she said. We tried. We built the dispensers. We optimized the nutrition. We reduced the process to calories in, calories out, and we were miserable. She looked at the sweet on the table. Humans need more than fuel. We need this. She gestured again. The eating together, the thing it tells us about ourselves. We survived this long because of it. The primary was still for a very long time. Then it reached out, slowly, with one of its 4 upper limbs, with a deliberateness the Priya recognized as intentional communication, the way you moved when you wanted to make sure nothing was misunderstood. And it lifted the small sweet from the table. It did not eat it. The Vareth, as far as anyone would later determine, could not eat human food and would not have tried. But it held the small cardamom round in the articulated end of its upper limb, and it oriented its photoreceptive band toward it, and it was still. Priya watched it. She was not afraid. The Confederation's emergency fleet arrived at Kepler 7 2 days later. 3 warships, the lead vessel broadcasting the full panoply of first contact protocols, heavily armed, moving with the aggressive certainty of an institution that had decided the right move was to establish dominance immediately. They did not get the chance. The Vareth ships were already lifting when the Confederation fleet entered the outer system. Smooth and unhurried, all 7 of them, rising from the planes in that same deliberate patience. The Confederation fleet moved into intercept positions, and the Vareth simply went around them, the way water goes around a stone, and continued on their course toward whatever coordinates they had entered when they decided this particular world was finished with them. Before they left, the primary broadcast a signal, not on the standard channels, on the frequency the translator drone had been using, addressed specifically to the outpost. Priya was in the kitchen when the drone received it. She was making breakfast, parathas, because she had woken up at 5 in the morning and decided that the colonists had earned parathas. And the drone rendered the signal from the counter where she had left it the night before. Assessment complete, the drone said. Classification, viable, a pause, a longer one, the kind that had come to mean the Vareth were reaching for something at the edge of what translation could manage. Classification addendum, viable and. The drone struggled. It produced 3 attempts at the word, each slightly different, each slightly wrong. Then it settled, irreplaceable. Priya turned the paratha on the tawa, watched it brown. Thank you, she said to the drone, to the kitchen, to the primary. Wherever it was now. She made 43 parathas, and then she made 4 more, because there were always people who came back for seconds. The Confederation's response to what happened at Kepler-7 was, initially, administrative bewilderment. The fleet commander's report described the encounter in terms that struggled to accommodate what had actually occurred. The Vareth had landed, been observed by a colony logistics coordinator who had continued cooking throughout, and then left without any of the engagement the fleet had been prepared for. The Confederation Council convened a special session. Intelligence analysts were brought in. Exosociologists produced 14 competing theories about Vareth motivations. None of them, as far as Priya ever knew, talked to her. She heard about the special session from Yusuf, who heard about it from the Colonial Liaison Office, and she processed this information while chopping onions for the dinner she was making. And she thought about what the primary had said, viable and irreplaceable. She thought about it the way she thought about a difficult recipe, turning it over, tasting it, trying to understand what was in it. The Vareth, the analysts eventually concluded, were conducting a galaxy-wide census. They had been doing it for. The estimate varied between 400 and 700 years, which was a range that said more about the limitations of human intelligence than the Vareth's patience. They were looking for something. The terminology they used across all 47 sites translated to some variation of the same concepts: produce, sustain, endure. The sites where humans had met the threshold had been the ones where, and here the analysts diverged wildly, community cohesion was highest, or resource management was most efficient, or psychological resilience scores were strongest, or any of several other metrics the analysts projected onto data they were not equipped to read. They were all partially right. They were all missing the thing Priya thought she understood, standing at the counter with her onions, which was simpler and older than any of their frameworks. The Vareth were asking, do you know how to keep each other alive? Not militarily, not technologically, in the oldest sense. Do you feed each other? Do you pass the knowledge of how to do it from one generation to the next? Do you sit together and eat and know who you are because of it? And at 47 sites across 3-star systems, the answers had been some version of yes. At Kepler-7, someone had been making rotis. 3 months after the Vareth left, the supply freighter arrived with the replacement parts for the nutrition dispensers. Yusuf Chen supervised the installation and then came to find Priya in the kitchen. We can get the dispensers back online, he said. Full nutritional optimization. Every colonist's requirements precisely calibrated. He paused. It would free up a significant amount of your time. Priya was in the middle of teaching Ida's mother, a woman named Sawarse, how to make dal. She had decided she needed to teach people. She could not be the only one who knew how. The chain had to continue. Yusuf, she said, turn the dispensers on for supplemental nutrition. Use them for what they're good for. She handed Seer the spoon, and then come learn how to make dal. He looked at her, at Seers, who was stirring with more confidence now. At the small cardamom rounds Priya had made that morning, sitting on the counter, the Confederation Council sent us a formal commendation, he said, for the Kepler-7 first contact engagement. They called it, he checked his comm, a demonstration of sophisticated diplomatic acumen in a high-stakes interspecies situation. That's very nice, Priya said. They want you to present at a conference. About what? First contact protocol. Based on your, he gestured vaguely, your approach. Priya considered this. She added cumin seeds to the hot ghee in the pan. They had ghee now from the new supply shipment, and listened to them sizzle and pop, and thought about what she would say at a conference about first contact protocol if she ever went. She would say, make food, real food, the kind that takes time, the kind that has a history. Make it in front of them, and let them watch, because what they're watching is not the process. They're watching you. They're watching whether you know what you are and where you come from, and whether you pass it forward. Make enough for everyone. Sit together and eat it. Be what you are without apology, without performance, without the defensive crouch that intelligence always assumes when it encounters something vast and unknown and potentially threatening. You are the species that feeds its young long past the age when any other animal would have sent them off. You are the species that cooks for its sick and its grieving and its celebrating. You are the species that took the biological necessity of caloric intake and turned it into ceremony, into culture, into love made edible. That is not a weakness. That is the whole story, she would say. The aliens were not looking for warriors. They were not looking for diplomats. They were looking for something that could persist. And persistence is not the same thing as strength. She would say, "I was making rotis." She stirred the cumin into the oil, added the onions, adjusted the flame. "Tell them I'll think about it," she said to Yusuf. The Vareth returned to Kepler 7 14 months later. Not 7 ships this time, 1, and not to the plains. It set down, with the same unhurried precision, in the open space behind the outpost, the place where the colonists had built a small garden in the months since the first visit, a gesture towards something permanent, something that would continue after whoever had planted it was gone. There were tomatoes in it now, unexpectedly. Nobody had expected tomatoes to thrive in Kepler 7 soil, and yet, the primary came down the ramp alone. Priya was in the garden when it arrived. This was not planned. She had come to pick tomatoes because she had decided to make a tomato rice she had not made in years, a recipe she had learned from her own mother that was simpler than the biryani, more direct, a weekday meal rather than a ceremonial one. She was crouched between rows, picking the ripe ones when she heard the landing burn and then the subsequent silence, and then the sound of footsteps that registered less than a child's. She stood up. The primary was 12 meters away, walking toward her, 4 limbs in that configuration she had learned to read as calm attention. It stopped when it was 3 meters from her. The translator drone was inside. There was no translator drone. The primary reached out slowly, with one upper limb. It was holding something. She could not immediately identify it. A container of some kind, a material she did not recognize, shaped like nothing in any human design vocabulary. But it was holding it toward her, a gesture of offering so universal that no translation was needed. She stepped forward and took it. The container was sealed and she did not know how to open it. She stood holding it, the primary standing opposite her, and for a moment she felt the full weight of what this was. 2 species on a garden planet, 3 meters apart, one offering something to the other, neither of them with a translator, relying entirely on the grammar of presence and gesture, and the willingness to extend a hand and receive what was extended. She held up the container, raised an eyebrow, the human gesture for "how." The primary reached forward and showed her a small motion at the seal. She tried it. The container opened. Inside was a quantity of something she could not identify, a fine-grained substance, not a powder exactly, more like very fine crystals, in a color she had no word for, between bronze and amber and something else entirely. She lifted it toward her nose, cautiously. Then, because curiosity was sometimes stronger than caution, she dipped a finger and tasted it. The flavor was extraordinary. She could not have described it in any existing vocabulary. It was nothing she had ever tasted, and it was also, impossibly, familiar in its structure, in the way a good spice was familiar, in the layered complexity that told you it had a history, that it had been refined by use and attention and time. She looked at the primary. It was still, photoreceptive band oriented toward her face. Watching, she thought about what she would do with this. She thought about the tomato rice she was planning to make. She thought about the structure of the recipe, the tomatoes and the rice and the simple aromatics, mustard seeds, curry leaves, dried red chili, and she thought about where in that structure this new substance might land, how it might interact with the acid of the tomatoes, whether it was heat-stable, whether it would bloom in oil the way a good spice did. She thought, there is only one way to find out. She held the container up to the primary. She pointed toward the outpost. She made a stirring motion with one hand, a gesture so ingrained in her after decades of cooking that it was involuntary. She was asking, "Do you want to see what I do with this?" The primary was still for 3 seconds. Then it shifted, the small collective realignment she had come to understand, and it moved toward the outpost. Walking alongside her, at her pace, between the rows of tomatoes, she picked 3 more tomatoes on the way. Large ones, ripe, deeply red, still warm from the sun. The outpost learned to cook differently in the years that followed. Not better, not worse, differently. The Vareth substance, which the colonists eventually named ambari after the amber-adjacent color, turned out to be extraordinarily heat-stable, to bloom magnificently in hot oil, to interact with acidic compounds in ways that produced flavors entirely outside human culinary experience, and to have nutritional properties that the colony's biologists spent 2 years trying to fully characterize. The primary had brought 3 containers that first day. The next visit brought 12. By the 4th visit, there was a small Vareth installation near the outpost, staffed, if that was the word, by 2 Vareth who seemed to have been designated as something between researchers and neighbors. The translator technology improved rapidly. There were children in the outpost who grew up knowing the Vareth the way they knew the tomatoes in the garden, as a fact of their world, as something ordinary and present and not to be feared. Priya taught cooking classes. She had not planned to become a teacher, but she had always been someone who could not do a thing without thinking about how it was done and why, and eventually thinking about it out loud became teaching it. She taught the colonists, and eventually she taught some of the Vareth. In whatever sense the Vareth could be taught something so embodied and so human. They could not cook. They did not eat in any sense she understood. But they could learn the process and what the process meant, and she came to believe that this was exactly the point. You did not have to eat to understand feeding. You did not have to need to understand the need. She called her son once a week on the long-range comm, 6 light-year delay be damned, which meant the conversation was always a week behind itself, her message and his response out of sync in a way that would have been maddening, except that she had decided it was not maddening. It was just how it worked now. He had gotten married. She had watched the ceremony on a recorded transmission, alone in the kitchen at 3 in the morning, and she had cried, which she had not expected to do, and then she had made a cup of tea and gone back to bed. He was making biryani now, he told her, following her recipe, the recipe that was Usha's. That was Usha's mother's, that went back further than they could see. He said he was getting close. She sent him 3 corrections in her next transmission. The Confederation did eventually send someone to talk to her, not for the conference, that had been quietly dropped. Since the Confederation Council found the implications of the Kepler-7 encounter uncomfortable for reasons Priya thought were entirely about institutional self-regard, but an individual, a young exosociologist named Layla, very earnest, who had read every available report and come to Kepler-7 on her own initiative. Layla arrived asking questions. She arrived with a recorder and a theoretical framework and 5 years of academic work on the relationship between resource production and species, viability in post-expansion scenarios. She was extremely intelligent and had thought about this very carefully, and she had, in Priya's assessment, gotten approximately halfway there. Priya sat her down in the kitchen. She taught her how to make dal. The Vareth weren't assessing our technology, Layla said 2 hours into the session, stirring the dal with the focused attention of someone who was learning something and knew it. They weren't assessing our military capacity. They were assessing something else. Yes, Priya said. Cultural cohesion, Layla said. The persistence of cultural practice under duress. The ability to maintain non-survival behaviors during a survival situation. Priya added turmeric to the dal. The specific pinch adjusted for 45 people. Closer, she said, but that's still a framework. That's still talking about it from the outside. Layla was quiet for a moment. She was stirring the dal correctly now, had been for 20 minutes. Then what is it from the inside? Priya leaned against the counter. She thought about the primary in the kitchen door that first night. Photoreceptive band oriented toward the tawa, toward the puffing roti, toward her hands. She thought about the small cardamom sweet sitting on the serving table. She thought about Usha's locked drawer and the recipe in the notebook and the moment of not yet becoming now. She thought about Arjun making biryani 6 light-years away and getting it slightly wrong and asking her how to fix it. You know when you make something for someone, she said, and they eat it, and you can see that it's good? That the thing you made has reached them, has done what you intended it to do. Layla nodded. That feeling, that's what we were demonstrating. Not that we produce, not that we sustain, that we care whether the people around us are nourished, that we go to the trouble, that we know the difference between fuel and food. She looked at the dal. Any machine can make fuel. We made food. And the Vareth, whatever they are, whatever they had seen across 400 years of this census, I think they had learned to tell the difference. The dal was ready. Priya ladled it into a bowl and handed it to Layla and watched her eat it. There is a recording in the Confederation archives, low priority, largely uncatalogued, filed under the Kepler-7 incident reports, of the original translator drone's log from those first 48 hours. It runs to several hundred pages of rendered communication, most of it the Vareth's questions and Priya's answers, the kitchen conversation that the Confederation analysts had mostly dismissed as irrelevant to the broader strategic and diplomatic questions raised by first contact. Partway through the log, there is an entry flagged by the drone's processing system as anomalous. During the biryani's dumb process, While Priya was working on the side dishes, the primary produced a sustained subsonic vocalization that the drone logged but did not translate because it was outside its operational parameters. A researcher reviewing the log 3 years later noticed it and passed it to a Vareth language specialist who had been working on decoding the subsonic communication register. The translation took 2 weeks. The specialist's memo was brief. The vocalization, sustained over 7 minutes, was a structured pattern that corresponded to a specific category of Vareth communication. The closest human equivalent, she wrote, was not a statement or a question. It was a form she translated tentatively as witnessing. The Vareth had a word, a concept, really, embedded in sound, for the act of being in the presence of something that should be remembered, something that mattered enough to record, not in data, but in the body. The vocalization was a kind of imprinting. The primary had been making it for 7 minutes, while Priya made biryani in a small colony kitchen with 43 people waiting for dinner. Priya read the memo over breakfast. She was making paratha at the time. She read it and put her calm down and flipped the paratha and thought about the primary standing in her kitchen, silent in the way she had come to understand meant fullness rather than absence. And she thought about her grandmother's hands making dough in a kitchen in Chennai, the same motions, generation to generation, the chain her grandmother had never called a chain because to her it was simply what you did. The paratha was ready. She moved it to the rack and reached for the next piece of dough. Outside, the 2 Vareth researchers were in the garden, which they did every morning at this hour, standing in the tomatoes with their photoreceptive bands oriented toward the specific way the twin moons caught the atmosphere in the early morning. And one of them was producing a low sustained sound that Priya had heard before and now understood. And she thought, yes, she thought, witness it, it should be witnessed, all of it. This world and these tomatoes and these people and this improbable ordinary morning after everything. She pressed the next paratha flat and set it on the tawa. She could smell the ghee heating. She could hear the colonists beginning to stir in the quarters down the corridor. The small sounds of a community waking, 43 people and 2 alien researchers and 1 kitchen and the twin moons above the ridge and the tomatoes in the garden and the chain going forward, 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 always forward, generation to generation across whatever distances and whatever impossibilities lay between one hand, reaching out and another reaching back. The paratha puffed. She pressed it gently, one practiced motion. Some things, she thought, you do not need to translate. They carry themselves. Arjun came to Kepler 7 4 years after the Vareth's first visit. The transit had gotten faster. One of the secondary benefits of the relationship that had developed between the colonies and the Vareth was an exchange of navigation data that shaved weeks off the standard routes. And he arrived on a Tuesday morning looking like himself and like a stranger, simultaneously, the way children always looked when you had not seen them for years. He was taller than she remembered, though she could not understand how that was possible. He had his father's way of standing. She was in the kitchen when he arrived. This was not planned. She had been making khichdi, simple, restorative, the kind of food you made for someone arriving after a long journey, because it was easy on the body and warm, and asked nothing of the person eating it. She had not known he was arriving today specifically. She had not known she was going to make khichdi. The body knew things the mind was still working out. He stood in the kitchen door. He looked at her. She looked at him. "You're making khichdi," he said. "You've been traveling for 19 days, she said. "Sit down." He sat at the kitchen table. One of the Vareth researchers, the smaller one, the one who had taken to following Priya's cooking sessions with particular attention, appeared briefly in the doorway, processed the scene, and withdrew with the delicacy Priya had come to recognize as the Vareth's version of giving you privacy. She stirred the khichdi. She added a dollop of ghee at the end, the way her mother had always done, a last generosity before serving. "I can't get the biryani right," he said. He had been thinking about this the whole way here, she could tell. It was sitting at the top of his mind. "I know," she said. "I read your description. You're adding the saffron too early. When should I add it?" She set the khichdi in front of him. She sat down across from him. "After I eat," she said, "I'll show you." He ate. She watched him the way she had watched him eat for his entire life, the specific quality of attention that she thought probably did not translate across species. Or perhaps, she reconsidered, perhaps it did? Perhaps that was precisely what the primary had been attending to that night. Not the food, but the watching. The mother watching her child eat. The ancient mammalian verification. They are fed, they are here, they are sustained, all is well. He finished and looked up at her with the expression she remembered from when he was 5 years old and had eaten something very good. "Ma," he said. "I know," she said. She stood up. She went to the stove. She gathered the ingredients for the biryani and she began. The Confederation eventually produced a formal report on the Kepler-7 incident. It ran to 412 pages and contained 17 appendices and was classified Level 7 for reasons the summary described as related to national security, but which Priya suspected were related to the discomfort of a military and diplomatic institution confronting the possibility that its most sophisticated protocols were less effective than a middle-aged woman making dinner. The practical outcome was simpler. The Confederation established a new position, First Contact Cultural Liaison, and filled it with the best people they had. The training program included, because Layla had fought for it and was extremely difficult to argue with, a cooking component, real cooking, specific recipes, the accumulated knowledge of specific hands, the position's unofficial motto, which circulated through the program's first cohort and then became something of a tradition, was drawn from the Kepler-7 case. Someone had dug it out of the translator drone's log, not one of the primary's translated statements, but one of Priya's, rendered verbatim because the drone had logged everything. It was not a strategic insight. It was not a diplomatic principle. It was what she had said when Yusuf Chen asked her, in the first 40 minutes of the alien presence, what they should do. We do what we do. We make food. She is 63 years old when the second wave of Vareth ships arrives, not at Kepler-7 at Earth, at the oldest outpost there is, at the place where the chain began. She is in the kitchen at Kepler-7 when the alert comes through, making breakfast for the 49 people the colony has grown to include, and she processes the alert the same way she processed the first one. She finishes what she is doing, she flips the paratha, she watches it brown, and then she goes to the comm. The Confederation's emergency channels are calm in a way they were not the first time. Someone has done the work, someone has read the reports, has attended the trainings, has understood, at least partially, what the Vareth are looking for and why. The Confederation liaison at the Earth site is reporting, voice steady, that they have opened the cultural exchange facility and that the cooking demonstration is underway. Priya stands at the counter with the comm in one hand and the spatula in the other, and she listens to the liaison's description. The biryani team, assembled from volunteers across 12 different cultural traditions, working in an open kitchen space designed specifically for this, the smell of it going out through the ventilation into the space where the Vareth observers are standing. The familiar shift in Vareth posture that the new generation of liaison officers had been trained to recognize. She puts the comm down. She turns back to the stove. She finishes breakfast. 49 plates, everything hot, the paratha stacked and soft, the chai in the big urn. She calls them all in and they come in and they sit together and they eat. And the twin moons of Kepler-7 are doing that thing they do in the morning, catching the atmosphere, and outside in the garden the tomatoes are doing what they always do, which is simply growing, which is simply persisting, generation after generation in soil that was not made for them, and learn to welcome them anyway. She will calm Arjun later. She will tell him about the Earth contact. She will ask how the biryani is coming along. She will remind him about the saffron timing, though she suspects by now he has gotten it right, because he is careful, and he pays attention, and he has his grandmother Usha's patience, which is the most important ingredient in anything. She is old enough now to understand that the chain is not a metaphor. It is the thing itself, the actual mechanism. The reason any of them are here, on this brass-skied world 3 light-years from the nearest star with a human name, eating together in the morning, fed and feeding, the knowledge of how to nourish each other, passing from hand to hand in the oldest form of transmission there is. You do not have to be afraid of what watches you if you know what you are. She knows what she is. She is the one who feeds you. She presses her glasses up to her forehead, where they always end up, and she goes back to the kitchen, and she begins. The first time a Vareth asked Priya a question it could not process, she was making chai. This was 3 weeks into the ongoing presence of the 2 Vareth researchers at the outpost, the ones the colony had come to call, without any particular ceremony, first and second, because they needed some way to distinguish them, and the Vareth had not yet offered their actual designations, if they had designations in any human sense. First was the larger one, the one Priya suspected was the primary from the original visit, though she could not verify this. Second was slightly smaller, moved with a quality she could only describe as curiosity made physical. Always angled slightly toward whatever was most interesting in the room. Always a fraction of a moment ahead of first in orienting toward new stimuli. The translator technology had improved considerably by then. The Confederation had sent a specialist in Varith linguistic architecture, a man named Petrov, who had been working on the subsonic register problem for 18 months, and he had made progress fast enough to suggest he had been close to a breakthrough before he arrived. The translation was now cleaner, more complete, with a much lower rate of the flagged uncertainties that the early drone had produced at every turn. Second was watching her make the chai when it asked, "Why do you do the same things repeatedly?" Priya measured the tea leaves. "That's not quite a question. Can you sharpen it?" A pause. "You have made this preparation before. The same preparation. Multiple instances. The repetition serves no variation function. The output is equivalent each time. More or less equivalent," she said. "Never exactly. The variance is negligible. To you," she added the tea to the water, watched it begin to color. "Not to me." Second was quiet. The new translator caught the subsonic undertone of what Petrov had classified as the Varith's active processing register, the sound of it actually thinking, which was one of the stranger things Priya had adjusted to, the literal sound of being heard. "Explain," Second said. She added ginger, fresh from the garden, the knobby piece she had pulled this morning, and the smell was immediate and sharp. She added cardamom pods, slightly crushed. The water was just beginning to boil. "Every time I make this, it's slightly different," she said. "The ginger today is younger than last week's. The water tastes different depending on which tank is being drawn from. I'm in a slightly different mood. I slept well last night or I didn't. All of that is in it." She looked at the pot. "When I drink it, I taste all of that. I taste today specifically, not just chai in the abstract, today's chai." Second produced a sound. Petrov, who had been sitting in the corner pretending to work, looked up and made a note. "You are not replicating," Second said. "You are recording." Priya considered this. "In a way, though I'm also creating, every time." She poured the milk in and the mixture immediately went rich and pale. Same structure, different thing. "The recipe is the structure," Second said. "The instance is the day," she said. Another long processing pause. "Then, humans have a mechanism for encoding time into matter. We call it cooking," she said, "and a few other things." She poured the chai through the strainer into 2 mugs. She set one in front of the space on the counter nearest Second, which she had been doing every day for 2 weeks. The Varith could not drink it and never touched the mug, but Second always oriented toward it. She had started thinking of it as a form of courtesy in both directions. She offered, Second acknowledged, and something moved between them in that exchange that the translator could not yet render. She picked up her own mug. The first sip was, today specifically, the younger ginger, sharper, the good sleep. The particular quality of the morning light through the kitchen window hitting the tomatoes in the garden. She closed her eyes for 1 second, opened them. "Good," she said, to nobody in particular. Second produced the witnessing vocalization. Petrov's pen moved faster. There was a morning, in the 2nd month of First and Second's residency, when Priya did not cook. She had woken at 4 in the morning with a feeling she recognized and could not do anything about. The missing of her son that was sometimes a small dull ache and sometimes was not, and this morning it was not. It was the anniversary of the day he had left for the transport that took him to the designer's collective 6 light years away, and she had known it was coming, and had thought she had prepared for it, and she had been wrong, which was the way this always went. She sat in the kitchen in the dark, and she did not turn the lights on, and she did not make tea, and she did not start breakfast. She sat at the kitchen table and she put her hands flat on the surface and she breathed. She was aware, at some point, of First in the kitchen doorway. She did not look up. First was silent for a while. Then the translator, now a small unit clipped to the doorframe, rendered, "Query you are." A pause, a processing delay. The new kind that Petrov said indicated the Varith working with emotional rather than informational content. "Not producing." "No," she said. "Query, what is occurring?" She looked at her hands on the table. She thought about how to answer this for an alien intelligence that communicated in layered frequencies and had been running a galactic census for possibly 700 years and had no concept of what it felt like to miss a person who was alive and well and simply very far away. "I miss my son," she said. The translator took longer than usual. First was very still. "Miss," it said finally, with the tone shift that meant cultural logging. "Define." She thought about it. to feel the absence of someone as a presence, not as nothing, as something, a weight where they should be. She pressed her hands flat against the table. It's not bad, it means he matters, that he's real and that he's mine and I love him. The missing is the proof of that. She looked at her hands, but it's still heavy. First was still for a very long time, longer than the processing delays Priya had come to know. The translator did not speak. Then First moved. She watched it, from the corner of her vision. It moved to the counter. One of the upper limbs reached slowly, deliberately, toward the small wooden box where Priya kept the cardamom pods, and it touched the edge of the box very lightly. Not picking it up, just touching it. The substance you use, First said, the small pods. You use them in the preparation you make when you want to. Another long pause. Convey care. She looked at the box. At first limb touching it. Yes, she said. Cardamom in the chai, cardamom in the sweet. Things I make when I want people to feel looked after. The substance carries the function. Over years, she said, over a lifetime of associating it with being cared for. When I smell it, I am already held. She looked at First. You figure that out? We observe, First said. Over sufficient observation, patterns emerge that are a pause, not quantifiable but are legible. She looked at her hands on the table. She thought about Arjun, 6 light years away, in a space that smelled nothing like cardamom, and the transmission that would take a week to reach him. She stood up. She turned the light on. To the counter, and she took the cardamom box, and she began making chai, and First stood beside her in the kitchen and watched, and neither of them said anything else, and that was enough. The colony had a festival. This was Yusuf's idea, and Priya thought it was a good one, not for the Varith's benefit, not as a demonstration of cultural viability, but simply because it was time. They had been here 4 years, and they had not yet properly celebrated being here. The original colonists had arrived with a specific austerity of people beginning something difficult, and the difficulty had not entirely abated, and somewhere along the way the ordinary human insistence on celebration had been deferred. Yusuf said, at the community meeting, that they were going to have a festival, and he looked around the room at 49 people and he said, "This is our home. Let's act like it." The preparations took 2 weeks. The garden was raided for everything edible and decorative. The children made paper lanterns. 3 different colonists volunteered to teach cooking workshops, not Priya's kind of cooking, but their own. A Portuguese woman named Sophia, who made a salt cod dish that nobody but her liked but everyone pretended to, and a man from Osaka named Kenta, who had been making his grandmother's miso soup every morning since he arrived on the colony, and who turned out to be an exceptional teacher, patient and precise, and a teenager named Emre, who had learned to make flatbread from his father and made it faster than anyone Priya had ever seen, his hands working with the unconscious speed of something deeply practiced. First and Second attended the festival. They stood at the edge of the common area, which had been cleared and decorated, and they watched. The translator was active all evening, and Petrov stayed close to it, logging everything, but most of the evening the Varith did not ask questions. They simply watched. The lanterns that the children had made were being lit and released, floating up toward the ventilation shafts where they would trigger the safety cutoff and descend gently. A deliberate modification to the tradition, made with full acknowledgement that they were 4 light years from any open sky. And the children were watching them go up, and the adults were watching the children, and First and Second were watching all of it. Priya was watching Second. She had been watching Second for months, and she had developed a theory. She thought Second was young, in whatever sense youth applied to the Varith. She thought the particular quality of attention Second brought to everything, that forward lean of perpetual curiosity, the slightly faster orientation toward novelty, was youth. And she thought that youth, whatever the biology, had a certain recognizable universal quality, which was, everything is new and nothing is too much. Second had oriented toward the flatbread Emre was making at the demonstration table at the side of the room, had been oriented there for 15 minutes. Emra, who was 17 years old and had been slightly terrified of the Varith for the first weeks of their residency and was now slightly less terrified, though still cautious, noticed Second's sustained attention and, after a moment of visible internal deliberation, held up a piece of the flatbread toward it. It was a child's gesture, uncomplicated. "Here, do you want some?" Second was still for 5 seconds. Then it stepped forward, slowly, the same deliberate movement the primary had used at the serving table at the first dinner. It looked at the flatbread. It could not eat it. Emery knew it could not eat it. They both knew. But Emery had offered and second reached out and touched the flatbread very lightly, the same way first had touched the cardamom box, and then it stepped back. Emery smiled. He made another piece. Priya turned away before she started crying, which was something she was increasingly prone to in her 60s, and which she found both embarrassing and in some moods acceptable. She went to the kitchen and made herself a cup of chai, and she stood in the kitchen by herself for a few minutes in the quiet, and she thought, this is what we do. This is the whole thing right here. The offering, the reaching, the acknowledgement that we are here together in this impossible small space, and we might as well mean something to each other. She pressed her glasses up to the top of her head. She went back to the festival. 6 months before Arjun arrived, Priya had the conversation with First that she would think about for the rest of her life. Petrov had made a breakthrough in the subsonic register translation that finally cracked something he had been calling the deep channel. The layer of Varith communication that carried what he described as, with appropriate academic caution, something analogous to interiority. Not quite emotion, not quite philosophy, something that lived in the register between what the Varith communicated, deliberately, and what their bodies produced, with intention. Working with this register, he said, was like being able to hear what someone was muttering under their breath. The conversation happened late at night. The outpost was quiet. Priya was in the kitchen, as she often was late at night when she could not sleep, and First was in the kitchen, as First had increasingly been, not following her, she thought, but converging on the same space out of its own inclinations, the way that two people who spend enough time in the same place eventually find themselves in the same corners. The full-range translator was active. Petrov was not there. She was making a small batch of the cardamom sweets, not for any occasion, just making them, the way she sometimes made things to settle her mind. And First was standing near the window looking out at the plains and the moons, which was something First did often late at night, and she was working and it was quiet. First said, "We have seen many species." She looked up. "I know." "Many," it said again, and the deep channel gave the word a quality the surface translation couldn't fully carry. Not simply many in quantity, but many in the sense of more than you can hold in one thought, more than has resolution, a number that becomes a weight. "Over a long time," she said, "over a very long time." A pause. Many of them another pause longer. The deep channel produced something below the translator's current rendering, a sound that Petrov would later describe as the Varith equivalent of what you might call a sigh, if sighs could hold 400 years of accumulated knowledge. Did not continue. She stopped rolling the sweet she was working on. She looked at First. "Did you know?" she asked carefully. "Before you came here, before you came to any of the human sites, did you know if we would continue?" First was still for a long moment. Probability assessment was low, it said. "Your species is?" It reached for the word through all the registers at once, and what came out of the translator was halting and multiple. "Very young, very scattered, very loud. You fight each other, you waste. You spend enormous resources on," a pause, "on things that produce nothing." "Yes," she said. "We do all of that. We expected," First said, "what we had seen elsewhere. Settlements that could sustain the body, but not." It stopped. The deep channel murmured, "But not the interior, the self." The translator produced 3 words simultaneously: warmth, continuity, meaning. The thing that makes the body worth sustaining. She looked at the cardamom sweets in her hands. Small round things, made from condensed milk and spice, pressed into shape by hand. 40 years of making them compressed into the muscle memory of her palms. "But you found it," she said. It was not quite a question. "We found it at the first site," First said. "A small outpost, a woman making food." She looked at it. "Was that here?" "Here," it confirmed. She was quiet for a moment. "You could have told me that earlier." Something moved in First's posture. The particular small shift that Petrov had, classified as Varith humor, though he had noted that the classification felt inadequate. "The information was not mission relevant," First said. And then, through the deep channel, something the translator rendered as, "It would have changed how you cooked." She laughed. It surprised her. She laughed in the quiet kitchen on the alien world at midnight. And First produced a sustained vocalization in the witnessing register, and the twin moons came through the window and lit the flower dust hanging in the air. "No, it wouldn't," she said, when she had stopped. "I would have cooked exactly the same." "Yes," First said, "this is what we observed." She rolled the last sweet. She lined them all up on the rack to cool. She looked at them, small and imperfect, each one slightly different, no two exactly the same. You must have been disappointed, she said. So many sights, so many that didn't. She stopped. She thought about what First had said. Did not continue. I'm sorry, she said, for the ones that didn't. First was still for a very long time. The deep channel was active, at a level below what the current translator could render. And Priya heard it without understanding it, the way you heard music in a language you didn't speak. The structure without the content, the emotion without the words. To observe the end of a world, First said finally, the translator stopped. The deep channel continued for a few seconds, and then it stopped too. She waited. She did not press. There is no word, First said. In your language or in ours, there is only the knowing of it. She nodded slowly. She picked up one of the cooled sweets and she set it on the counter in front of First, the way she had been doing since the first dinner. The offering, the gesture. First reached out and touched it, very lightly, and did not let go for a while. We are glad, First said quietly, with the full weight of both registers together, that you continued. She pressed her glasses to the top of her head. She looked at the moons through the window. So are we, she said. The recipe book was Arjun's idea. He brought it up after 3 days on the colony, after she had shown him the biryani and corrected the saffron timing. He had been adding it too early, which drove the volatile aromatics off before the dum, so that the finished rice was missing the specific saffron quality that lived in the fragrance, rather than the taste, and it was an easy fix, the kind you couldn't learn from a written recipe and could only understand from watching. And after he had met First and Second, and spent an afternoon walking the garden with Second, who had oriented toward him with the same forward-lean curiosity it brought to everything new, and who he had, by the end of the afternoon, started talking to with the ease of someone who had grown up around the Vareth at one remove, through his mother's transmissions. You should write it down, he said, all of it, not just the recipes, the everything. What you were thinking when you made the biryani that first night, what it felt like. The Vareth in the kitchen. What First said about the cardamom. That's not a recipe book, she said. That's a memoir. It's both, he said. He had his father's way of standing and his grandmother Usha's stubbornness. It should exist. Ma, it should be written down. She thought about Usha's locked drawer, about the notebook that had been held back for years and then offered, about the moment of not yet becoming now. She thought about her own hands kneading dough in the kitchen at 4 in the morning, and the 49. People who needed breakfast and the Vareth watching from the doorway and the chain going forward into whatever came next. I don't know how to write it, she said. I do, he said. I'll help you. They sat down together at the kitchen table, Arjun with his calm and Priya with her tea, and they started at the beginning. A kitchen in Chennai, a woman with flour on her hands, a very old recipe. They went slowly. There was a lot to say. Second sat in the corner and listened. The deep channel was active, low and continuous. The sound Petrov had learned to recognize as the Vareth equivalent of absorption, the state of receiving something that mattered. Outside, the twin moons moved across the brass-colored sky. The tomatoes grew in the garden. The colony woke and ate and worked and slept and woke again, the ordinary, irreplaceable rhythm of a community sustaining itself, generation by generation, in the oldest way there is. Priya pressed her glasses to the top of her head. She looked at her son. She said, "Start at the beginning." He typed. She had flour on her hands when the ships arrived. She read it. She thought about it. She thought it was close but not quite right. She thought, that's not where it begins. Earlier, she said, start earlier. How much earlier, he asked. She thought about her mother, about Usha, about a woman in Chennai, whose name she did not know, who had first made this recipe and passed it forward. About all the hands the knowledge had moved through, all the kitchens, all the mornings. As far back as you can go, she said, and then a little further. He looked at her. He smiled. He deleted the first line and began again, and the chai cooled in her mug, and Second leaned forward in its corner with the whole of its attention, and the chain went forward and forward and forward. There is a particular quality of light on Kepler 7 in the late afternoon that Priya has never been able to adequately describe in the transmissions she sends to Arjun. She has tried several times. She has said, it is the color of the sky just before a monsoon, except there is no monsoon coming. She has said, it is the color of old brass, of turmeric, of something seen through amber. She has said, it makes everything look like it is remembering something. Arjun, who is better at description than she is and always has been, once wrote back and said, it sounds like you mean the light looks like it has time in it. She thought about that for a while. She decided he was right. The light on Kepler-7 in the late afternoon looks like it has time in it. 4 years of afternoons. The years before that, when the colony was still raw and uncertain and everyone was still adjusting. The first dinner. The biryani under the sealed cloth, steam seeping at the edges. The 7 ships on the plains. All of it accumulated in that specific color that exists nowhere else in the universe, as far as she knows, because every planet is specific, and this is the specificity of this one. She thinks about this sometimes while she is cooking dinner, when the light comes through the kitchen window at exactly that angle and hits the turmeric in the bowl and the steam from the pot and the flour dust that is always in the air of her kitchen, and everything glows briefly in a way that is particular to this moment in this world and will never be repeated exactly. She thinks, I am here. This is the day I am in. The biryani will be slightly different from last week's because the rice from this batch absorbs water at a different rate and the saffron is from a newer tin. I slept well. Arjun called this morning and he has gotten the saffron right at last, and I told him so, and he sounded pleased in the way he has always been pleased, by praise, trying not to show it and failing, which is something he got from his father. She thinks, every dinner I have ever made has been the record of a day. This one will record this day. The 49 people who will eat it will carry something of this day in their bodies, though they will not know it. That is also fine. The record does not need to be legible to be real. She stirs the dal. She adjusts the flame. First is in the doorway. This is not unusual. First has spent more time in the kitchen doorway in 4 years than in any other single location in the outpost, a fact that Petrov has noted in 3 separate papers and which Priya considers unremarkable. Where else would it be? The kitchen is where things happen. The kitchen is where the chain moves. Query, First says. She glances over her shoulder. Yes, the book, First says. The translator has a slightly unusual quality on the word, the cultural logging tone. The Varith have been processing the concept of the recipe book for 3 weeks, since Arjun explained it to Second in the garden. In the book, First continues, you will record the preparation, the method, the history. Yes, she says, and everything around it. The way the kitchen smells, the people I was cooking for, what I was thinking. A pause. The book will be given to others, future people, she says, people I won't meet, maybe on worlds I won't see. Arjun's children, if he has them, their children. She thinks of the notebook in Usha's locked drawer. I don't know how far it will go. That's the point. First is still for a long time. The deep channel is active at a level she can hear but not yet understand, though she has been listening to it for 4 years and she understands more than she could articulate. The Varith census, First says, slowly, working toward something, records what we observe, species by species, world by world, whether they continue or do not continue. A pause. But we do not record. Another pause. Longer. The interior, the self, the thing that makes the continuation matter. She turns to look at it fully. It is watching the pot on the stove. You record the fact of survival, she says, not what makes survival worth the effort. She turns back to the stove. She thinks about this. She thinks about the Confederation's 412-page report and its 17 appendices, and the fact that nobody had called her. She thinks about all the frameworks and protocols and assessments, all the machinery of institutional response to something that had been, at its core, very simple. We've been doing that wrong too, she says, both of us, recording the wrong things. First does not respond for a while. The light through the window is doing the thing it does, turning the steam from the dal golden, making everything look like it has time in it. The book, First says finally, would you? It stops. The deep channel produces something the translator takes an unusually long time to render. Make one for us, a book of what we have observed. The interior, not the census, what was worth recording. She looks at it. She has learned to read it over 4 years, as she once learned to read her mother-in-law's silences. What she sees in First right now is something she would not have had a word for when the ships arrived. But she has a word for it now. Longing. You've seen a lot of endings, she says quietly. Yes, you should write those down, the things those worlds contained, so they're not just gone. We do not have first stops. We have never had a recipe. She almost smiles. She turns to face it fully, her wooden spoon in one hand, flour still on the other, and she says, then let's make one. The sun does its amber thing through the window. The dal bubbles gently. Second appears in the doorway behind First, its forward lean of perpetual curiosity, drawn to the kitchen by something it has learned to recognize over 4 years. The specific quality of a conversation that matters. They begin. Arjun leaves Kepler-7 after 6 weeks. He leaves with 20 hours of recorded conversation. a draft structure for the book, and the correct biryani. The correct biryani took 3 attempts and a great deal of gentle correction, and 1 hour of Priya simply making it in front of him while he watched and said nothing, which he found harder than he expected and more useful. At the transit port, before he boards, she gives him the cardamom box. Her mother's cardamom box, the small wooden one with the brass clasp that has been on her kitchen counter since the colony was established. He holds it and looks at it and then looks at her. "Ma, I have the recipe," she says. "I have the book." "I have," she taps her temple. "Take it, put it in your kitchen. When you smell it, you'll be home." He puts it in his bag. He hugs her in the particular way he hugs her, which is the way he has always hugged her since he was old enough to understand what hugging meant, with his full weight and his full intention, nothing held back. She presses her glasses to the top of her head against his shoulder, and she breathes. Then he goes. The transport lifts and she watches it go, and she stands on the landing pad for a while longer than necessary, not because she expects anything further, but because it seemed right to stand there, to witness the going, the same way she had witnessed the arriving. First is standing behind her. She had not heard it come. It is very quiet. They stand together and watch the transport become a point of light and then disappear. "He will return," First says. "Probably," she says. "Eventually. The colony will be here. Yes, you will be here." She considers this. The brass sky, the twin moons beginning their afternoon rise, the plains where the ships had landed 4 years ago now empty and ordinary, just land, just the world going about its business. "I'll be here," she says. "As long as I'm here, I'll be here." She turns back toward the outpost. The kitchen is waiting. There are 49 people who are going to want dinner, and she has the beginning of a new idea, a dish she has been thinking about for 3 weeks, something that uses the ambari in a way she has not tried yet. In combination with fresh tomatoes from the garden, something that does not exist yet, that has no name yet, that will be when she makes it, a record of this specific day on this specific world 4 years after everything changed. She picks up the pace. She has work to do. The chain goes forward. In the archive at the First Contact Cultural Liaison Training Facility, there is a recording, not classified, not particularly prominent, easy to miss among the thousands of hours of Kepler-7 documentation, of Priya Nandakumar standing at a stove explaining to a very large alien the concept of mise en place. It is 17 minutes long. She is making a simple lentil dish. The alien, which the recording identifies as Varith Researcher Designation First, stands in the upper right corner of the frame. The translator drone is visible on the counter. What the recording captures, for 17 minutes, is a woman cooking and talking, and an alien listening. Cadets at the liaison facility are required to watch it in their first week of training, not because of any particular diplomatic insight it contains, not because of any extractable principle or protocol. They are required to watch it because their program director, Dr. Layla Osi, who has been running the facility for 8 years, and who learned to make dal in a small colony kitchen on Kepler-7, believes that before you can represent the human species to anything outside it, you need to understand what the human species actually is. The recording does not answer that question, but it gestures toward the answer, again and again, in the 17 minutes of a woman cooking in a small kitchen light years from the world where she was born, talking to something she cannot fully understand, offering what she has. Cadets usually finish watching it in silence. Some of them are moved in ways they find difficult to explain. Some of them go to the cafeteria afterward and eat something slowly, the way they haven't eaten in years, paying attention. This is what Dr. Ozi is waiting for. This is the beginning of the lesson. The lesson is, you come from people who kept each other alive, who learned how to do it and then taught someone else, and then they taught someone else, and on, across every catastrophe and every distance, hand to hand. The knowledge of how to nourish each other moving through time like a recipe in a locked drawer, held for the right moment, given when it mattered, carried forward into the future by whoever was next in the chain. That is who you are. That is what they are asking when they come and assess you and stand in your kitchen and watch your hands. The answer is, the same hands that have always done this. Go make something, feed someone, begin.